Welcome to the Global Seminar of the Global Columbia Collaboratory. I am Shannon Marquez, Dean of Undergraduate Global Engagement at Columbia University, and I'm so excited that you've joined us today for a conversation about the most pressing concern facing the world today, the COVID-19 pandemic and the discourse around prioritizing public versus economic health. Now, since I've spent my entire career working in global public health and as an administrator working in higher education, and as a parent of 2 high school age children, of course, I've been actively monitoring, planning, and engaging in related discussions about the COVID-19 pandemic on a daily basis. And the fundamental questions associated with this debate are at the center of all of our decision making. And everyone around the world is facing this same challenge at the same time. So today, it is indeed an honor to have some of the world's leading authorities here with us as part of the Global Columbia Collaboratory to have a robust discussion about both sides of the issue. The Global Columbia Collaboratory is a virtual exchange platform supported by the Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement in partnership with Columbia Global Centers and Columbia World Projects. The Collaboratory brings students, thought leaders, and educators together. It promotes cross-cultural communication and enhances skills and global competence to allow students to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to empower them to make a difference in the world. The global seminars, such as our seminar today, frame important global topics, and reflection activities provide focused opportunities for students to share diverse perspectives on the global challenges presented in each seminar. As learnings and perspectives are shared across the collaboratory, the ideation activities support the creative process of generating and communicating new ideas, and students are encouraged to collaborate to support the further development of ideas into projects that have the potential to address the most urgent challenges of our time. Now, we are thrilled that the inaugural cohort of 60 collaboratory students who are from Columbia College, General Studies, and Columbia Engineering have been participating in a 3-seminar pilot this summer, and they're joining us today from 17 countries around the world. Some of our students will ask questions to our panelists, and I encourage the global audience to also submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Again, I want to welcome everyone, and I want to thank all of our partners and our esteemed panelists. We are so pleased to be working directly with the Columbia Global Centers for these seminars. And at this time, I want to introduce Safwan Majri, Columbia University Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development, who will introduce us to our panelists today. Safwan?
Thank you very much, Shannon. And again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to our students, welcome to our esteemed panelists, and welcome to our global audience that is joining us from all over the world for really an important and timely conversation. Just a quick word about the Columbia Global Centers, which have been in existence for about 10 years, envisioned by our president, Lee Bollinger. They have been around with the objective of connecting the local with the global and to create opportunities for shared learning and to deepen the nature of global dialogue, exactly what we are doing today. We're in 9 countries on 5 continents, and we have been exploring using the global centers as regional hubs and creating global pop-up centers this fall to reach our international students who are stranded and dispersed all over the world. The topic today of our seminar, the false choice, public versus economic health, we will be taking a look at an issue that is being vigorously debated in government chambers and corporate boardrooms all around the world. Every country and every leader is now making decisions that will impact our collective and individual health at the local as well as at the national level. The economies on which our livelihood depends are of course affected by those kinds of decisions and policies. Some believe that no policy options exist that can benefit both public and economic health, and that we must choose one over the other, while others say that it is impossible to cleave the two, sacrificing one for the other, because like Solomon's decision, that would destroy both of them. For the final of our 3 Global Columbia Collaboratory seminars, for this pilot summer session, we brought together some of the world's leading authorities, and I'm not exaggerating here, on the very issues that are relevant to this debate. So I'd like to start by introducing Mary Bassett, who is professor and director of the Francois Xavier Bagnoud Center for Health and Human Rights at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Bassett's career has spanned academia, government, and not-for-profit work, and has been devoted to promoting health equity and social justice, both in the United States and abroad. Dr. Bassett's many awards and honors include the prestigious Frank A. Calderon Prize in Public Health and the Kenneth A. Ford Lifetime Achievement Award from Columbia University. Welcome, Mary. We're really delighted and thrilled to have you. Harrison Hong is the John R. Eckel Jr. Professor of Financial Economics at Columbia University. He has contributed to a number of topics in financial economics, especially on behavioral finance, stock market efficiency, speculative bubbles and crashes, social networks and investments, and corporate sustainability and climate change risks. In 2009, Harrison was awarded the Fisher Black Prize. Well known for his out-of-the-box thinking about liberating the economy, Harrison is now working on how physical distancing affects businesses. Thank you, Harrison. Wafa Sadr is a university professor at Columbia University. She is professor of epidemiology and medicine and is the director of ICAP, the International Center for AIDS Prevention at Columbia. Wafa is also the director of the Global Health Initiative at the Mailman School of Public Health. She is a prominent researcher and has led numerous epidemiological, clinical, behavioral, and implementation science research studies. I have had the pleasure of working and traveling with Wafa in a number of African countries and seeing firsthand the impact of her work, saving literally tens of millions of lives. R. Glenn Hubbard is a close friend and colleague and is a professor and dean emeritus at Columbia Business School. He is also the director of the Jerome A. Chazen Institute for Global Business. Glenn is a specialist in public finance, managerial information and incentive problems in corporate finance, and financial markets and institutions. Glenn is former Deputy Assistant of the U.S. Treasury Department and consultant to the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and he was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President George W. Bush. Glenn has written and co-authored many books, but one that is particularly relevant to today's discussion is the book Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise: 5 Steps to a Better Healthcare System. I would also like to introduce Professor Andy Haynes, who will be joining us for our student Q&A session. Andy is Professor of Environmental Change and Public Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He is former chair of the university's UK Health and Social Care Policy Committee and a member of the World Health Organization's Advisory Committee on Health Research. He also chaired the Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission on Planetary Health. Finally, I'd like to introduce my good friend, Linda Fried, our moderator today. Linda is the Dean of Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. Dean Fried was trained in cardiovascular and chronic disease epidemiology. She was named as one of the top 1% most influential scientific minds of the past decade. I'll repeat this. One of the top 1% most influential scientific minds of the past decade by Thomson Reuters. The New York Times recognized Linda as one of the 15 world leaders in science. Linda is the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including election to the US National Academy of Medicine and French National INSERM International Prize in Medical Research. Linda, over to you.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you, Safwan and Shannon, for kicking this off with the level of energy I think we are all excited to respond to. Deeply appreciated, and I'm thrilled to be here on this important topic with everyone who's on this webinar right now, including our distinguished panelists. I'd like to pick up from where Shannon left off, and with the point that we are in the midst of a global pandemic, one that's due to a novel coronavirus, COVID-19. This virus has to date killed 630,000 people worldwide, officially, along with estimates that we're undercounting by at least 200,000 people. In the US, there have been over 146,000 deaths and 4.2 million people infected, and case numbers are still rising. Around the world, excess deaths are rising in Latin America, particularly Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, and Chile, and in India and South Africa. Some countries, on the other hand, are not seeing excess deaths, like Norway, Denmark, and Finland. Others, like Germany, have kept excess deaths at a fairly consistently low rate. At the same time, the economy is struggling. There have been massive job losses, risks of homelessness, and children are hungry, and corporate bankruptcy has risen. We are certainly seeing all of this in the US. And school reopening for young children, young people in high school and in higher education is being constrained by concerns about exposure and transmission. The pandemic is costing the US, it's estimated $350 million a month, and it's projected to cost the US almost $8 trillion over the next 10 years. But the US is not alone, unfortunately. No country will be immune from this toll. So we have large questions ahead of us, all of us, to contemplate. Questions like knowing the cost as well as the complexity. How do we think our way through this to optimize the ability to resume work and education? Do we have to choose, as Safwan was saying, between work and school and our health, or the health of people we love, as some politicians have asserted? In making decisions about restarting the economy, a big question is whether we can build back better after this pandemic. And what are the considerations we would have to keep in mind to make wise decisions about what better should be? Do societies have to choose between investing in health and preventing disease, or having a robust economy? And should we accept that choice? And in fact, is it a false choice? So to discuss these issues today, I am really privileged to be joined by this wonderful panel, whom Safwan has already introduced. So I'd like to kick this off thinking about first how the response to the pandemic in terms of our public health measures has changed our economy. In many countries, we have adopted what has been called conditions of extraordinary measures, such as physical distancing and lockdowns, closed borders, highly increased needs for medical care. Other countries have had a minimal response. And I'd like to turn to Dean Hubbard. Glenn, given this very wide variation in country-to-country response, what are you seeing in terms of how the economic consequences have varied with the public health response?
Thanks, Linda. It's a great question, and thanks to Safwan and Shannon for putting this panel together. I would make 3 points in response to your question, Linda. The first is about health itself, the so-called R factor. The goal here is to stop a non-converging series, an ever-expanding pandemic. This is not an issue where there's economics on the one hand and health on the other. They're the same, they're together, they're a coin with two sides. And we really have to start first and foremost with public health and the virus. And I say that as an economist, not as a medical specialist. The second point is about economic consequences being linked to the public health response. You know, as you said, we did go through very aggressive measures of closures of businesses, of schools, in some parts of the world, even complete lockdowns for a period of time. That, of course, was aimed at stopping the lack of convergence, the excessive spread of the virus. Many of the methods that were used were viewed as having negative economic consequences. At the beginning of all of this, there was a debate, for example, where people would say, well, if you slam the economy shut, you may reduce the virus faster, but you would have larger economic costs. Again, I don't think that's the right way to look at the trade-off. The faster we get the virus under control, the better the economy will be. 2 subpoints on that. One, in addition to public health infrastructure, we really need to focus on testing and tracing. And here economists can be helpful. There are ways to suggest pricing models, regional compacts to ensure cheaper testing and its availability, and how to do tracing in subpopulations. So this is something I think that is going to be super important. A second point there is that these closures of much of the economy can be undone in their economic effects by policy. So for example, we have had in the United States programs to help small and mid-sized businesses adapt, amplified unemployment insurance benefits, payments to households. Some European countries have chosen a different mix. So rather than saying, is it health or economics, we need to use policy. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a political football, as everybody in this webinar knows, that is making that complicated. The third and final point I would make in answering your question, Linda, is that while people have focused on the closure part from an economic perspective, the real fear that economists have is that the closures can lead to demand problems. So you mentioned corporate bankruptcies. What happens if people are out of work too long and their skills atrophy? What happens if the social sector can't deliver the services that it needs? So public policy, in addition to the public health so-called supply side, really needs to focus on the demand side too. And I apologize for using the words supply and demand, but as an economist, I just can't help it. I'll stop there for question 1.
Thank you. Well, maybe let's build on one side of this equation, Wafa. Can you help us see a graduate level of public health and help us understand what it takes to protect people's health? And can we do this before we get a vaccine? What's involved? And maybe can we do it in a way to be able to go back to work?
And thank you very much, Linda, and thanks to all for the opportunity to be with you today and to share some of the thoughts about what we can do and what we should do. So I thought I would show a couple of slides, and hopefully you can see them at this point in time. And just to remind everyone as to what do we have available to us in our toolbox in terms of controlling epidemics in general. And I think what we have are some of the measures that Glenn mentioned that are critically important. And these are population level interventions that include, for example, directives on limitation of mobility of the population, stay-at-home orders, restrictions on travel, closure of schools and colleges and universities, and limitation in the numbers of individuals who can congregate together. And these measures have been put in place in a variety of different countries with differing in rigorousness, I would say. And some of these measures, of course, have been beginning, some countries have begun, and some states in the United States have begun to ease some of these population-related interventions. I want to also move on to some of the individual level interventions that we all have as well on our fingertips, to be able to control epidemics. And these include the physical, or I call them physical rather than social distancing, the use of face coverings or masks, the frequent hand washing and sanitizing, the cough and sneezing etiquette, the disinfection of surfaces, the stay home if you're sick, directives, as well as, very importantly, the isolation of COVID-19 cases, as well as the quarantine of contacts, which gets to the contact tracing issue that Glenn mentioned. So we have, these are the two very different types of interventions, but many of these, of course, have been put in place in order to minimize transmission and to control this pandemic. There are also potential biomedical interventions, and these include testing. Again, this was mentioned again by Glenn before, vaccines, as well as the use of antiviral drugs and neutralizing antibodies for both prevention and treatment. We all know, and we certainly are all eager and awaiting the availability of a vaccine. But I think in the meantime, we really should realize that we have a huge number of interventions in our toolbox that I mentioned, as you can see here, the population and individual level interventions. And these types of interventions are what I'm calling non-pharmaceutical vaccine. I think we should, and I think it's really important that in anticipation of a biomedical vaccine, that we have to optimize as much as we can the use of these non-pharmaceutical interventions, because in many ways, this is now our vaccine. This is what we have in hand now, and what we need to be cognizant of, and what we need to work hard to try to implement this as much as possible. Now, just to touch on, I think also just to reflect that the availability of a biomedical vaccine, hopefully we anticipate maybe by the end of this year, by the beginning of next year, is not a panacea, because even though it's a biomedical intervention, we have a lot of hope that we will have if not more than one effective and safe vaccines. But very importantly, to get the uptake and coverage with this vaccine will be very, very vital, and will require a lot of population level interventions, individual level interventions as well, to get people to accept the vaccine and actually want to get the vaccine and want their loved ones to also receive the vaccine. But going back to the non-pharmaceutical vaccine, or these interventions that are now available to us, I think some of the work that's been done in different institutions, certainly here at Columbia University, in preparation for reopening the campus and so on, has focused on how can we get a culture of caring, a culture of collaboration across different institutions and also between different individuals, so that actually all of us can adhere to, particularly to these individual level interventions. So at the university, for example, there's the Columbia Compact, which has been developed and is posted now online on the Columbia website. And this compact is, in a way, a commitment that all of us have to sign and commit to indicate that we are committed to adhering to these interventions, so that we can protect ourselves from this virus, as well as also we can protect others from the virus. So just want to again end by highlighting we do have a lot of interventions at our fingertips. What we need to do is to think about how we can optimize their use as we move forward. And I'll stop here, Linda.
Thank you, Wafa. One follow-on question to parallel the question I asked of Glenn. Different countries have applied different approaches in implementing these non-pharmacological interventions. Has that made a difference? Has that changed the ability to control the epidemic at a national level?
I think that we do have data. Yeah, we have data from a variety of different countries and states and so on, that you can actually map exactly and precisely when these measures were put in place and then what happened to the trajectory of the epidemic. So we have convincing data and from a variety of different sources that demonstrate that these actually work. The question is, of course, how do you sustain them for a long period of time? And I think then the critical issue, I think there's no doubt that they work. I think the question is, how do you ease these restrictions? And when do you ease these restrictions? So I think there need to be specific metrics in place that then communities can look at these metrics and determine whether this is the right time to ease some of these restrictions or not. And also as well to decide very carefully which of the restrictions should be eased first, and so on and so forth. I think another principle to keep in mind is that we need to recognize that because we don't have a safe and effective, ubiquitously used universal vaccine, is that we may need to take one step forward and then take two steps back in easing some of the restrictions. We have to be driven by the data and essentially tailor our interventions based on what the data are telling us.
So I'd like to build on what you just said and turn to Harrison. You've been working to understand the impact of actually following these physical distancing protocols on the economy. And can you comment on what you think the connection is and whether there's a way to get the economy adequately back up and running while enforcing physical distancing?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. Thanks, Safwan and Shannon for organizing this great panel. I'm happy to share some thoughts. So a lot of the thoughts I'm going to share is really based on ongoing research with Nung Wang at Columbia Business School. We're both financial economists, so I think our approach. I think the language we would use to think about the pandemic is that and I think this is sort of the numbers we have in mind in thinking about sort of these reopening questions. Is that in March the reproduction number for COVID-19 globally. I think if you look at the data, I just checked last night on the data. Now there's pretty good data for the last few months. Standing at 2.5. A 2.5, and I think Glenn alluded to this. A 2.5 pandemic with reproduction number basically kind of swamps out everything, right? So obviously, the good news is if you look globally now, everyone is hovering at around 1. So basically, these sort of the lockdowns, in March and April, was able to get it down to 1. I mean, I think one thing I would emphasize is that I think it was not obviously true that we could get it down to 1. So I think that's some good news, right? I think there was another world where we would have been basically always stuck at 2 or 2.5, right? I don't think that's a foregone conclusion. I think that's a piece of good news that I think we should start with and kind of put on the table. So we're at 1. Now, some of the bad news is that as these economies have started inching toward reopening, you're seeing that number go above 1 a little bit. And I think this is universal. I checked, there's several good websites now that are kind of giving you data, and I think this is due to Wafa's point. So we're basically kind of starting at a point now where we're hovering around 1. It's not great because that means, I think in most places in the world, we're living with the pandemic. And I think here the language I would use is risk. We're living with pandemic risk. In other words, and I think the decisions we make, and I think this is very much through kind of a risk reward framing, right, is that we're going to be living with pandemic risk for a while. I mean, even I think if there are some successful vaccines, it's going to be kind of a long transition. So what does that mean? So at a reproduction number of 1, and just remember, the other thing is, I think basically by the end of the year, I think tomorrow, there's going to be the official release of the GDP data in the United States. It's like a whopping minus 34%, right? So it's enormous. I mean, I think it's just like, I think, Glenn can kind of comment on it, it's just like many more times than I think anything the United States has ever experienced. So I think we should also take that into account. I think this is a number that I think in particular is really affecting the vulnerable part of the US population. Right? So to these questions about what the comparative performance is of different countries, obviously politics plays a big role, but I think we should also recognize there's a huge amount of inequality that plays a big role. You can't really compare Germany, I think, to the United States. It's not really quite a fair comparison if you look at kind of the data and the vulnerable population we have, and I think the United States compared to, let's say, Germany. Now, I think kind of on this issue, we're at 1. And I think that, if I kind of look at the numbers and I think about what is an optimal first principle response, there's obviously going to be rewards for us, given that we're at a manageable risk level, right? With some luck, we'll be okay. We'll kind of tread at 1 and we can kind of slowly reopen. And, I think that's kind of would be a good scenario, right? That until sort of we get some normalcy with the vaccine, we'll be able to kind of be around 1. And I think that here, the thing I would kind of emphasize, if you think about these models from some first principles, is you want a lot of flexibility, right? So inherently, I think built into risk management is that we have to have flexibility, and I think as Wafa said, in adjusting to the data, right? that, I think if things are looking good, we can basically kind of cruise along. But of course, there's going to be some sense in which if the numbers start, the infection numbers start going up, you're going to have to sort of bring things back down a little bit. I think for sure, many of the successful countries practice this policy. You can debate a little bit about, what exactly are the benchmarks, right? What exactly are the cutoffs? So I think that's just something that we're living through a great experiment. I think, different locales are going to have to play. But I think the general philosophy of risk and reward, I think should be sort of, kind of front and center. And so my own view, of course, I think in New York City, which is the area I know the best, I mean, for sure, I think, we should definitely experiment with starting schools, especially at the elementary level. I think the costs are just so high that I think that at this point, given the low level of infections, given kind of the reproduction numbers we're seeing, given the experience in Germany, we should, if we're able to sort of protect, particularly, I think, the more low income parts of our population, I think that's where we should more target our resources, in terms of the opening. I think basically, higher income groups are going to be able to have flexibility and resources to adjust themselves. I think the inflexibility and the exposures are really in helping, I think, the adjustment on the part of lower income. Because for them, physical distancing is not obviously a choice, right? And if you're going to choose between having to get work and you have no buffer of financial assets, that's sort of a double problem from the point of view of the economy. Thanks.
Thank you, Harrison. So as you said, the world is actually in a set of scenarios here that it's never been in before. And a key issue in how to make decisions is to draw on what we do know. One area that we do know is something about whether or not the economy and health are independent of each other. So I'd like to ask Glenn first, does health affect the economy?
Well, it absolutely does. And there's some important lessons from that for the COVID-19 pandemic. The first is the importance of public health infrastructure. If health affects the economy, the ability to work, the ability to participate in the economy, the ability to enjoy life and flourish in it, so too is public health infrastructure is important. A pandemic is not really a black swan. I can remember in the White House almost 20 years ago, working on pandemic games. People will remember there after 9/11, there was an anthrax scare and there was a lot of concern about induced pandemics in the population. And so there was a lot of role playing and modeling in public health expenditure then. I'm sure it's been done many times since. We were simply unprepared. We might not have been able to predict COVID-19 per se, but the idea of a pandemic is not a black swan. We need to begin those investments now, should have already done it. The second, to pick up on something Harrison said, in a sense, in the health economy link, the COVID-19 pandemic is really like a magnifying glass shining on a problem, light on a problem that was already there, which were health inequalities in the population that are not uncorrelated with income and wealth inequalities in the population. We know that much of the severe reaction to COVID-19 came from individuals with comorbidities. And by that, I don't just mean how old they were, but health comorbidities that were strongly linked to income. And the investments in public health infrastructure for low-income people is important all the time, and particularly now. The second is about reopening. As we think about reopening, to emphasize a point Harrison made, we have to think about it not just with an economic mindset, but with an engineering mindset. So if different groups in the population have different potential exposures and consequences of those exposures to COVID-19, we may need to sequence those reopenings. We may need to compensate some individuals that have less financial and other flexibility in their lives than others. So policy really needs to take a step back. Sometimes I worry when people talk about a reopening in an economic sense as if it's a light switch or a 0-1, we're open or we're closed. That's not it. And any smart change is going to have to be gradual and with baby steps, and it's going to be uneven. It may make more sense to open faster for younger, healthier people than for older people in some parts of the country ahead of others, and to constantly let public health data inform that. So I think we need a public health mindset, an economic mindset, and an engineer's mindset.
So I appreciate it when I hear an eminent economist make an argument that supports public health as a public good. Did I get that right, Glenn?
You did. We economists, we occasionally get some things right. We try.
Good. So can you, for those people who may not be familiar with the terminology, can you define what a public good is, please?
Sure. A public good would be a good that's produced or invested in that gives benefits beyond those doing the investment. So for example, national defense benefits all of us. General public health and making sure that we aren't exposed to pandemics is something that benefits all of us, whether or not we're the direct payers for that investment. Public goods are important. Unfortunately, probably a story for another day, our political process tends to underinvest in a wide variety of public goods, but this one is absolutely critical. And as I say, it's not a black swan, and it's not something that people shouldn't have been thinking about.
So Lynn, let me kind of jump in on Glenn's thing about public good. You know, I think there's also this sort of how underfunded, I think as you pointed out, you know, with public good is how underfunded is public good, or really in public health. And I think if you work through models, and by the way, I think, you know, many economists are super sympathetic to this view about public good. I think particularly in the case of public health, I think, you know, I think one of the good bright spots, I think hopefully of the pandemic we learned is that, you know, public health ultimately can reduce aggregate risk, right, associated with the fallout from these pandemics. And I think if you do calculations using sort of the most up-to-date models, I think you can make a pretty good case. You know, I think typically countries around the world, something like 1% of GDP, 1 to 2% of GDP on public health. But in fact, you know, I think if you work through most of these models, you should be really thinking about 1 to 2% of capital stock, which is more like 3 times the amount of GDP. Is sort of what kind of a baseline number is what typically falls out of these models. And I think that that's a kind of an important point that you know we should learn from this pandemic to push forward, is to really push for this notion that I think, you know, public good in terms of public health is just extremely underfunded. I think I would say relative to other types of public goods like national defense, for instance.
If there's one thing.
That's true. Many local health departments have budgets that are half the size of the police department in their jurisdiction. And on a national level, the proportion of economists will have to tell me whether GDP or GNP has declined by something just under 10%. And at state and local level, the declines in funding to state and local health departments have been more in the range of 15 to 20%. So the US is a real outlier when it comes to investment in public health among its peer wealthy nations. And things are going in the wrong direction. And in recent years, we've seen under not just Republican administrations, but under Democratic administrations, a decline in investment in public health infrastructure. Linda, I know I haven't been asked a question, but
You were about to be.
Oh, well, then I should sit and wait my turn. But I have to say,
you don't
there's
need
just
to be asked a question,
something
Mary.
really surreal about those of us who are, well, not all of us are sitting in the United States, but those of us who work or who derive our livelihoods from US institutions, having this conversation without sort of taking note of the gravity of the situation this country is in. We have, something under 5% of the global population. And by our count, we have nearly a quarter of the world cases. I mean, how in the world did this happen? And if we ask ourselves honestly, I think it was completely predictable, related to the sets of social policies that have taken over our country in the last 40 years. And we're paying a price now for the fact that we don't have paid sick leave, we don't have universal health coverage, we don't have you know, a living wage for most people, we don't have affordable housing, and we have a huge national housing crisis. And I could go on and on, which create the backdrop that make all of the things that Wafa, you mentioned as strategies within the sort of narrower perspective of public health extraordinarily difficult to implement. So, you know, epidemics change history often. I hope that ours, you know, changes our trajectory in a good way. So now I'll wait for my question if I haven't already answered it.
You answered the question in pointing out that the other side of the question I asked Glenn, which is that economics and the economy, as well as our philosophy, affect health. And that's really critical to see the bidirectional links here.
Yeah, Linda, could I jump back in on that? Because I think a critical part of this for a country like the United States that is a federalist organization, we have states and we have a federal government. Going back to your point about public goods, you know, if I am a state, it's not just the case that I have to care about the well-being of the people in my state, because those people can travel elsewhere. People from other states come to my state. The federal government really has to have a large block grant for public health infrastructure. This is not something that we can depend on individual governors and state legislators to fund. So I know that's a bit of a political football, but from a purely economic perspective, the nation as a whole has a stake in this, not just 50 individual states.
So I wonder, Mary, if I can just go back, building on that. You and I both know very well that public health is the quintessential example of the actions we must take collectively to protect our health and well-being. That's by definition. Just to look at the US public health system for a minute and the infrastructure that Glenn's talking about, can you just briefly tell people what it consists of and why it matters?
Why public health matters?
No, why the public health system matters.
Why the public health system matters. Well, okay, so I'll be speaking really based on my my experience as being the health commissioner for New York City. But it's always been very difficult to define public health. We used to sometimes say it's from A to Z. It's the air we breathe to controlling zoonoses or Zika or something. And it's a regulatory strategy. By and large, part of the reason that New York City had such a strong and has such a strong health department is because it has more robust regulatory authority than many jurisdictions through its Board of Health that is able to pass the equivalent of laws with regard to health through the Board of Health without resorting to the legislative process. So a lot of it is setting standards for the air we breathe, how we report diseases, and it also, of course, has an educational function to ensure that people have the information that they need. I think it's the regulatory nature of public health which has made it so vulnerable to, and the fact that it functions best as a centralized activity that has made it vulnerable to criticisms of people who don't like state authority.
Yeah, there are various ways to express what it delivers to the people. To the population.
Well, I mean, we're responsible for, you know, we measure the success of our work with measures like mortality rates and life expectancy. And we're responsible in public health, and that's to ensure the health and well-being of the population, everybody, not just the poor.
Yeah, I think to build on this, I do think we need to maybe think of a third dimension beyond economic impact and public health impact of this epidemic, and think of the societal impact. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that Mary is touched on and has written about and so on, which is the potential impact for good and bad on a societal level in terms of obviously the fracturing that's happening now between different groups and politically, as well as, of course, the shining of a light on the disparities in our country. So and they're huge negative societal impacts, but I do, and I'm an eternal optimist, I do hope and believe that at the same time, we do have an opportunity to shine a light on the importance of public health, because it often is public health that, you know, is thinking about the needs of the forgotten, you know, the needs of those who are not receiving the care, the importance of access, the importance of being counted, and so on. So in a way, we could utilize this crisis that we are in now to try to make the point much clearer in terms of public health and its impact on the society overall.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I like the definition. It's what we do collectively to ensure our health. Because, you know, as everyone on the panel and Glenn has really made so crystal clear, that in order to preserve and protect life, we need more than healthcare services and more than a public health system. We need the whole of society to advance people's health and well-being.
Yeah.
Linda, if I may, the collective in what Mary was just pointing to is so incredibly important, right? And when you think of public good, the way that Glenn defined it, I don't know how many people know this, but public good, the concept of it, is rooted in the work of the 14th century Tunisian philosopher and economist Ibn Khaldun, who defined it as maslaha. And maslaha is social well-being. But as Wafa would probably agree with me today, in contemporary language, maslaha, if it's not defined beyond that, means private well-being. And thus one has to distinguish between maslaha amma, which is the public well-being, versus maslaha khassa, which is the private well-being. And something else that Mary said that really struck, and I know, Linda, you want to get to climate and to a discussion about climate. I mean, it's the US, of which I'm a proud citizen, even though I have been outside of the United States since March, since the outbreak, has produced 25% of the cases around the world, even though we count for only 5% of the world's population, which is exactly the percentages when it comes to CO2 emissions, right? We produce about 25% of cumulative carbon dioxide emissions. So there you have it. I mean, you know, what are we doing both within the country and into the world?
So I'm very pleased to see that Andy Haynes has joined us. And so Andy, welcome. And I can't resist integrating you into this fabulous conversation. Many people, from moral philosophers to business ethicists to economists, are saying that we need to question how we weight different kinds of wealth. The last few hundred years, certainly the West is focused on monetary wealth, but there's also social wealth and ecological wealth. Does that frame for us any way to think about how to get ourselves out of this pandemic better than we went in?
Well, thanks, Linda, and apologies to colleagues for coming late from another meeting, but great to be with you. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the concept of GDP, of course, is very much at the heart of the political discussion, I guess, certainly in my country, and I guess in yours as well. It's all the focus really is on growing GDP, and yet we know that GDP is a very poor indicator of human well-being and tells us nothing really about the environmental costs of improving the kind of human prospects. So increasingly there is a questioning then of the centrality of GDP in political discourse. And I think we're seeing, for example, just in recent weeks, the New Zealand government now putting well-being at the heart of their economy. Climate change mitigation is one part of their concept of well-being, but it's also equity and other improving health and so on, as well as part of that concept of well-being. We've seen that the Kingdom of Bhutan, of course, is well known for having its gross national happiness index, as well as an alternative paradigm for the development of that country. So we are seeing the beginning really of alternative ways of viewing what human progress is. And I think we in health have an important contribution to make to that debate. Obviously, health itself, mental and physical health, is a very important contributor to well-being. But my view is that it's not good enough just to look at human health. We actually have to look at the health, the state of the natural systems on which ultimately the health of our civilization depends. And that's perhaps the missing link in a lot of what we've been doing in public health and global health up to now. So the question then is how we can integrate, what kind of integrating concept can we develop that integrates human health with the health of these natural systems? And that's where this concept of planetary health comes from. But of course, the indicators for monitoring that are still not fully established. And we need to do a lot more work on those. But they do essentially mean that we have to live within the planetary boundaries, these finite boundaries in terms of climate, biodiversity, land use, water, and so on. And we have to sustain our population within those planetary boundaries. And that's going to be a challenge certainly for the foreseeable future. So, sorry, a rather long answer but a very important question. We could spend probably days debating it.
So, Andy, are there jobs in building back an economy that would support health and sustainability?
I believe so, yes. I mean, if you think of the data, I mean, if you, for every $1 million you invest in the fossil fuel industries, you get about, I think it's 2.5 jobs, something of that order. You get about between 7.5, 7.8 jobs if you invest in renewables and energy efficiency. So on that rather basic measure, you know, we're getting much better value for money. But of course, a worthwhile economy, a well-being economy, is more than just energy. It's also about caring for people. So it's about supporting the health system. It's about caring for the vulnerable. It's about having a strong primary care system, not just focusing only on hospitals. And we've seen the weakness of doing that in many countries in recent weeks and months. So I think we do need to look holistically at what kind of economy do we need to sustain in order to support humanity in the Anthropocene. And that will be an economy which invests in the environment, much lower environmental impact economy. It will be much more of a circular economy, because we know that a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions actually come from the way in which we consume, because we throw away so much. And you won't get to a zero carbon economy if you don't move to a circular economy, which involves much more remanufacturing, recycling, reuse, sharing finite resources. And that has to be the way that we go. And that can be a productive economy, and it can be a life-sustaining economy.
Thank you. Mary, what would that do to help resolve inequalities?
Right, that was my question, thanks.
What are your thoughts, Mary?
No, I mean, I was asking Andy that. I mean, I think all of us understand that, you know, that the sort of existential crisis that we face as a species is the way we are plundering our planet. You know, there is no plan B for our planet. At the same time, we have particularly in the United States, but in all countries, systems that generate enormous inequality. Some countries generate sort of offset that inequality through various government actions more than others, certainly more than the United States. And in addition, the economy in the United States is very much organized along a racial hierarchy, which is not simply analogous to an income hierarchy or wealth hierarchy. These are also huge challenges that face us. Data that we've analyzed show that the age standardized mortality rate from COVID so far, this was just up through May, for Blacks is a little over 3.6 times higher than it is for whites, 2.8 times higher for Latinx population, higher for all people of color than it is for whites, but the most, as in many outcomes, including mortality, the most severe differences are seen between the population of African descent and the white population. So this, of course, is a legacy of African enslavement.
Right. Thank you.
So how are we going to fix that? Where does that fit in with your green jobs?
Yeah.
Well, Miriam,
well, it has to. And we always think about public health as the leadership and the knowledge to elevate the floor and the ceiling of health for everyone. And, you know, what I'm hearing from Andy's framing is that we need to power the economy to enable us to accomplish that. Maybe to wrap this, Safwan, before we turn to our questions from our students and everyone else, it's to say you're sitting today, I believe, in Jordan.
Right.
You know, there are regional differences, perhaps, in the welcoming of the kind of message that Andy just framed out. Is that a right supposition?
I think so. I mean, I'm actually in Aqaba right now on the Red Sea, and you literally, I mean, you can see Israel, Palestine, you can see Egypt, you can see Saudi Arabia. From where you are, and within a regional context, I mean, I think it is fascinating just to see how different countries have reacted, and you know, going back to what Harrison was saying earlier, how some reopened and some reopened abruptly and have had what's being referred to, whether accurately or not, a second wave. Jordan has really been incredibly aggressive in terms of the containment of the virus. It went into lockdown, very severe lockdown, on March 18, and for a number of weeks, there was no movement whatsoever. The airport continues to be closed, except for repatriation flights in and out of the country, and everybody who flies into the country on one of those repatriation flights is quarantined for 2 weeks in a hotel before they can go home, where they self-quarantine for 2 additional weeks. So as a result of that, in a country of a population of 10 million, many of whom are refugees, the country has only experienced 1,200 cases cumulatively and 11 deaths during that period. I do think that it helps. Leadership plays a very, very big role in how decisions are made, and there is a very clear chain of command in this country, and there's a very effective leader in the king, who is a military person. So I think, you know, all of that, and his choice of a health minister, I think it was also something that that paid very well economically. Of course, there's been 15% of the GDP of Jordan's GDP is through tourism, and that has come to a halt. The private sector has had to shoulder much of the pain, and because of emergency defense laws, there are restrictions on what the private sector can and cannot do in order to deal with the impact on their financials. But people have also been hurt if they are daily workers, just like the case in the United States, and funds have been established. But anyway, to wrap it up, I mean, you look around you, Lebanon contained it, was an early success, but then they reopened, and they reopened very quickly, and they just went back into lockdown a couple of days ago. Israel is a case of a country that was celebrated as having really conquered it. And then Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, called on everybody to go out and celebrate the victory. And restaurants and bars were open, and not only that, schools were reopened. And now, among developing countries, Israel leads the way, or leads the pack along the way in terms of per capita infections, second only to the United States. And Saudi Arabia is representative of the Gulf region, where you have a tremendous amount of expatriate labor who are really living in camps, congested together. So the idea of physical distancing is a foreign concept, and because of that, Saudi Arabia has been, I think they've recorded more than 300,000 cases so far, and many members of the royal family have also been infected. So I think that what Andy has posited is absolutely right, in that how a country is able to combine and deal with both things. And what Harrison has said in terms of reopening doesn't mean it's not a black and white thing. Glenn, you said it. It's not a switch that you flip on or off.
So we have, through this discussion, 3 intersecting pandemics, what public health folks would call a syndemic. We have the parent pandemic of COVID-19, which is affecting the entire world. We have a slow burning and long-standing and severe pandemic of injustice and inequality and racism, which has been erupting in distress around the world. And we have an emergent pandemic, if you will, resulting from climate change. This will not be our last pandemic, in part because of climate change. And so the question provocatively that Andy is pitching is, could we come out of this current COVID pandemic with the will to fix all three in one solution? Thank you all for a really important conversation, and I'll turn this now to Shannon Marquez for the question and answer session.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you. I think the ongoing discussion will continue because we have some very provocative questions from our students, a few of which who are joining us live. So our first student, Virginie Feist, if you can go ahead and come live. She's actually joining us from New York and has her camera on. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the panel. So there are a lot of similarities between the current public health crisis and climate change. We need to listen to science. We need to address the distress from certain people. We need also to have a global human responsibility to change our behaviors. So my question is, what are the lessons we can draw from COVID-19 to bolster climate action? Thanks.
Well, anyone on the panel want to address this?
Sure, I can address that. So I want to kind of jump in. I think this is a kind of a great topic because I think I'm just sort of finishing up a consulting thing for the IMF, and they were basically exactly kind of arguing about these things about whether the pandemic is going to accelerate or decelerate the shift to the green economy. You know, I think, I mean, I would kind of lay out a few things. I mean, first, I don't think it's an obvious given that all these problems have the same solution. Right? In other words, like I think the solving inequality problem is sort of related to a public health problem, but of course, solving the racism problem is not exactly, you know, these are all going to basically be slightly different solutions. I think that's personally to keep in mind. But of course, they intersect in the following way, which is more about belief of society about this type of public good spending. Right? In other words, I think historically, if you look at the will of society politically to spend on these types of, you know, essentially these are very preventive ex-ante mitigation strategies. They're going to be really good for society, but like way down the road. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, the population is not exactly always super thinking from, you know, far down the road, particularly I think if they have a variety of other issues. But I do think that it is true, I think just empirically, that after disasters, right, societies will make a stronger link, right? So there was a poll that came out in Axios about what Florida residents think about climate change after the pandemic, you know? And so they obviously now kind of in their mind basically think, yeah, you know, basically, yeah, disasters really do happen, right? And I can now basically be much more attuned. I think this is a very behavioral, I don't think it's sort of irrational per se. I think we all basically kind of learn if we think the risks are very low, we don't want to spend. But if we think the risks are elevated, of course, we're much more willing to spend, right? So I think in this sense, I think all of these things intersect. And I think the other thing, of course, is I think what Glenn pointed out about demand. You know, typically I'm pretty skeptical about, you know, subsidies for kind of green economies and everything, because I think economists think that basically you should just have a carbon tax. You know, that's kind of the most obvious way to kind of solve these problems and let the economy kind of figure out, you know, what's the best thing to do. But I do think that in this particular situation, given that we're going to be facing huge demand shortfalls, right? You know, what economists refer to as like fiscal multipliers, right? Spending on these types of projects that would historically in normal times, you might not think yield a lot of benefits for society, may actually have very high multipliers today, right? I think so for these two arguments, I think that these problems are very joined. Otherwise, I would have thought in a normal time, these are just very different problems and you would just solve them with very, very different sets of tools.
Okay, can I pile on what Harrison said? He said the word multiplier, which gets economists excited. So I'm ready to jump in. 2 points I would make is I think the question was super deep. One is about the role of the state The other is about the role of the global state. So let me start with the role of the state. I think what the pandemic is helping us learn is that the state can play a very large role in certain large public good projects. So in the United States setting, I think of the Lincoln era actions for homesteading, for the Transcontinental Railroad, for land grant colleges. You can think of those policies as being about individual opportunity. In some sense they are, but they're really about public goods. And I'm not sure Lincoln thought about economics, but I think that was the idea. Later on, the GI Bill, the interstate highways, these were examples of the power of the state, not just to do things that would create individual benefits, although they do, but large public goods. We are at a moment where I think the American people are more open to that as an idea. The second is about the global state and about pandemics and climate change. They are global problems. The United States, whatever policy course it chooses, is not by itself going to solve a pandemic or climate change. And these are about building international institutions. When I speak to audiences about climate change, I always remind them that if you think about trade, which we used to like, I guess is off the table now, but we used to like trade. It took decades to build the GATT, the World Trade Organization, international rules and frameworks. We've got to be doing this. The atmosphere doesn't care whether emissions are coming from India or the United States. A pandemic can start anywhere. So we need to rethink public goods in the United States, but we also need to have an attitude toward greater international cooperation in public goods. This is just an area where no country, no matter how powerful it is, can go it alone.
Virginia, thank you for your question. And please remind us of your major before we let you go.
Thanks, political science.
Thank you. So our next student is Maya Bickle, joining us from Maryland. Maya, you had a question, and remind us of your major.
And what year you are.
Hi, thank you all so much for this wonderful panel. I am a rising senior in Columbia College studying Middle Eastern Studies. So Dean Fried concluded this panel with the hope that we will have the will to fix all three crises we are facing: social, racial injustice, the climate crisis, and the pandemic. And Professor Hong, his recent answer touched on the question of the best way to approach all the various issues we are facing. I'm wondering, what is the way that we can outline a productive alternative framework? How can we frame our discussions and research and plans for the future in ways that take into account the fact that most issues we are facing are deeply connected with other issues: public health and the economy, public health and structural racism. Many of our panelists have taken this broader, multifaceted approach in their own work. Dr. Bassett, for example, has advocated for greater awareness of how social injustices and structural violence intersect with public health. And Sir Haynes has advocated for and researched the integration of health and sustainable development. And I hope to hear from them about how we can approach these issues in an integrated rather than a bifurcated framework.
So Andy, would you like to take it first?
Oh, well, great question. And I think it harks back a little bit to, I think it was Mary said just as I came in, the whole of society approach to health. For far too long, what we've done is we've had a society which creates ill health, creates injustice, creates racism and so on. And then we've tried to remedy these through the health system and through other public services. Instead of putting at the heart of our economy, an economy which actually generates health and well-being, generates jobs for all, and is a much less inequitable economy. So in essence, and I think the previous questioner was a political scientist, and I think they have a lot to teach us about how to address some of these issues, because many of these are in the domain of political science. And we as public health professionals are not always very well, we don't understand fully the frameworks that political scientists use to analyze. So we definitely need to learn from political scientists, and increasingly we need to take a transdisciplinary approach. And that is very different from the standard epidemiology or public health approach. Transdisciplinarity is about learning from each other. It's about respecting each other's language. Just as you have to learn different foreign languages, you also have to learn the language of different disciplines. And that's absolutely crucial. Many of us were trained in silos, narrow silos, and we need to get beyond that. And I think we need to work together in a mutually enriching environment to learn from each other as to how we can address some of the solutions to these complex problems. So very briefly, I think that what COVID has shown us is that those societies which one might have predicted to be very resilient were not. So both the UK and the US are not leading. And that also opens a space for other countries and other ways of looking at the world. And actually what we're looking at now is to see which countries have been much more successful. There are sometimes they're the smaller countries, they've got more political maneuver, they're less polarized than some of the big countries, they're less framed by ideology. And I think that's one of the other problems is we've been trapped in this kind of ideological polarization, which has prevented rational discussion. And also, I think many people confused by misinformation, and misinformation doesn't just happen by chance. It's there because it actually supports very powerful interests. And I think our political science colleagues would help us to understand that analysis much more effectively. So I think, just in conclusion, I would say, I think we do need to aim, and I know it's very difficult, as Harrison said, to aim for integrated solutions, but that's what we need to do. We need to take a systems-based approach, because if we don't do that, we'll fix one part of the system and we'll have unintended consequences on the other part of the system. So we do need to understand how things relate together, what the feedback loops are, and how we can avoid the unintended adverse consequences of our policies. So yeah, a lot more could be said, but that's a start.
If I could jump in on that too, I think that while an integrated solution is hard, integrated framing shouldn't be. I think back to Adam Smith, and Enlightenment thinkers generally thought that the goal of a society is mass flourishing. They didn't say GDP, not just because we didn't know what it was yet, but they didn't say mass output. They said mass flourishing. And what they had in mind was making sure that everybody can connect to the productive economy, whether that means the ability to work, to thrive, to flourish, and that everybody can reconnect when something happens, a technology changes, something happens in the world or a pandemic. That kind of framing starts to suggest solutions. And I think one of the things that's missing in our rhetoric and our inability as experts in silos to connect with the public is the absence of that framing. And I think Adam Smith's a good place to start.
I think Wafa wanted to say something, and I'd like to say something.
A couple of thoughts is just to add to another distinctive feature of the countries that have done well is that they all have female leaders. So just keep that in mind.
Very important. Really important point. Yeah.
When people ask why are we in the situation we're in the US is because it gets at some of the issues that we're discussing today is that we have in epidemic, we have very poor leadership and we don't have a plan. I mean, I think that's in essence, and we have fractured the trust between leaders and the society and the communities and the population within this country. So as we think ahead and move forward, I'm not sure that somehow it's going to be, if the way to think about the future is the anticipation or the hope for great leaders that are going to just help us move towards this, to solving these problems. I do think ultimately it really will be individuals from communities and coalitions across community groups that need to be built. So rather than having community groups that are interested in issues around racism, for example, which is very important, obviously, and then there are others that are focusing on climate change and others that are focusing on controlling the current COVID epidemic, can we really build, there are cross-cutting issues here that we've all identified, can we really build connections across these various constituencies so that we can move forward to a healthier society? And I believe that there is the opportunity, particularly having so many young people on this webinar, to think of a groundswell of amongst young people to demand something different and to build the kinds of coalitions and overcome the silos that have existed thus far.
And Wafa, wouldn't you agree also that on top of the political is also the psychological and the individual behavioral? How do you get individuals to change their behavior, to be more willing to wear masks, to do the various things that your social interventions in your slide you talked about? I mean, doesn't that require also interventions at the very psychological and behavioral level?
as well as also leadership and communication. I mean, I think that's been a lot of the reason, and the whole divide between people who are mask wearers and non-mask wearers is really driven by the politics. It's not driven by the evidence that supports wearing masks. So I think, again, it's we have, unfortunately, people have left their have looked to leadership and trusted some leaders to guide them down the wrong path. And how can we then, I think it's a very important question, but how do we get individuals to think about truly what is in their best interest, both as individuals as well as also as communities and societies and so on. And that's the challenge ahead of us, whether we want people to tackle COVID, or we want them to tackle racism, or we want them to tackle climate change. It is thinking about individual but also collective benefits. I don't discount the need for leadership and, of course, enlightened leadership and trusted leadership. That's going to be fundamental as well.
And on that note, I want to get back to Maya's original question, because she wanted to hear from Mary exactly on that issue. Mary?
I'm really not sure where we are in the conversation anymore, but let me just say that that I don't know if it was you, Harrison, who said that sort of we can tackle racism somewhere down the road. And I'm not either a social scientist, or which would include an economist, or I'm not a historian. But I would say that the picture that we've seen unfolding in the United States suggests that at the core of our vulnerability is a commitment to a racial hierarchy in this country, and a commitment to the extraction of wealth at the price of well-being of a very large sector of the society. And so we can't keep working like that and expect to remain safe. And I mean safe in the broadest way, safe from new viruses, which are sure to be unfurled, they, as both Andy and Linda have said, and safe in terms of our social fabric. So I don't think that we're talking about a minor fix. We can't continue to have, you know, these extraordinary dispensations from taxation of the wealthiest people in our society, and have a society that keeps us safe. So I do think that maybe this is nonpartisan enough. Everybody needs to register and vote, who is eligible to vote in the upcoming election.
Yeah, so Mary, I mean, I agree with your comment. So I was just saying that public health spending is not going to solve the racial.
Oh, you're absolutely right. No, I mean, most of what we're talking about is outside of the health sector. Not healthcare, not public health.
A lot of the
young people, as Maya knows, uses this word intersectionality. And I think that the problems that you've enumerated, Maya, are all interconnected and related to these very deep core problems. Harrison, I interrupted you, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, all I wanted to say was just that I think lumping in all these things has some unintended consequences itself, which is that, you know, if you think that most of the underperformance of the United States, right, it's a country that looks sort of, you know, looks like it should be doing well, but it doesn't do well. You might say, well, we underinvested in public health spending, but I don't think that's sort of the only reason. I think that because of these racial income inequalities, which are due to other issues, right, that now you're basically seeing it kind of magnified in this pandemic. So therefore, if you solve the problem, you don't suddenly say, well, if I increase public health spending, get more like tracers, that's going to somehow solve.
No, this is beyond the technical challenges of public health.
Yeah, so therefore, I think that in some ways I completely agree with you that I think solving, I mean, if you ask me the other way, solving some of these other issues of inequality would already basically deal with some of the other public health issues that we're dealing with.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if people are aware of the racial wealth gap in the United States, which means that for every dollar that a Black family has, a white family has 10. In Boston, where I am now, the net assets of a Black household is $8, and of a white household is $247,500. And these were data that were collected by the Federal Reserve Bank, or at least at their behest. So these gaps are, weren't created over one, rather extreme administration. These are very long-standing, but that doesn't mean they can't be changed.
Thank you. Thank you for this engaging dialogue around Maya's question too. So I want to move on to our next student, Lauren Alcindor, who's in Pennsburg, Pennsylvania. And Lauren, please introduce yourself to the panel. I'm sure they're eager to hear your question.
Hello, I'm a rising senior in Columbia College and I study English and linguistics. My question actually relates a bit to Maya's question. In acknowledging the toll that the coronavirus has taken economically and the many lives it's cut short thus far, it seems that the racialized way that COVID is affecting the world is often overlooked. In the US, Black and Hispanic people are disproportionately likely to be essential workers whose livelihoods are affected by the pandemic, and these same groups are also much more likely to catch the virus. How can we protect people of color during this pandemic and address the specific needs of these communities when it comes to public health? As a follow-up, how might this pandemic result in broad societal changes that affect these groups?
Thank you.
Thank you. Someone want to tackle that?
Sure. I'm actually I completely agree with Lauren's comment. I think that to the extent that, where I view that we should kind of spend the effort in terms of sort of, if you think about a lockdown, a lockdown, there's a lot of discussion about government and leadership, but, basically people in New York that had means already fled really way before the lockdown. You don't really have to have a lockdown to tell forward-looking people with means that, you don't want to hang around when there's a pandemic happening, right? You want to kind of get out of there. So in some sense, the lockdown really disproportionately hurts all the people that really don't have means to be locked down, right? And if you think about it, that's not a very good public policy because, ultimately lower income households are basically paying most of the price of managing the externality, which sort of makes no sense, from a public policy perspective. So if anything, you want to subsidize, this is again, first economics principles, you should subsidize individuals for helping contribute to a public good, right? Because, ultimately that's sort of what we're paying for with these lockdowns, is we're basically trying to create some public good so that you have an economy that's not going to be inundated by a virus. So what I'm doing with, and I think Glenn's Institute, Chasen, has sort of funded some of this research. I think this is an issue that's not only, by the way, a US issue, it's a developing country issue, right? Being locked down in India is extremely difficult, so I think, it's not that the United States is the only country with a vulnerable population. And so, we're working with some fintech to try some experiments where basically you're going to incentivize households to, if they achieve certain targets of social distancing, you basically just do a conditional transfer, right? So that this is in lieu of these sort of very across the board uniform lockdowns that I think are not very effective. And I just go back to Glenn's comment that, at this point in our society, we should be able to experiment with much more first principles, productive ways and I think kind of on a first principles argument, there's no reason to kind of lock down and not pay essentially the essential work, the essential workers, all of these other guys who can't really lock down themselves. I think that's something that I think it's hard to argue that that's like the right policy from a first principles perspective.
Can I ask, what do you think about incentive payments? Because people are going to work for minimum wage in settings where they literally are risking their lives as people shoulder to shoulder in meat processing plants who were.
I think they're a good idea, but I would go broader. I mean, Tim Geithner, who was a former Treasury Secretary, and I wrote a paper together this summer to guide Congress calling for a doubling of the earned income tax credit, an extension to childless workers. It's really hard to say which jobs are essential. We can name several and then others will come to mind. A better idea is just subsidizing all low wage work, and we'll capture some of this. It's good policy anyway, but if this helps the Congress focus on it, I'm willing to get on that bandwagon. But I think subsidizing low wage work is really critical.
In Massachusetts, they have a 3-page single space list of jobs that were considered essential during the lockdown. I I think that that's the working list that people use. It's like 40% of the workforce. It's not.
I'm saying I wouldn't even try. I would just subsidize all low-wage work.
Yeah.
Excellent.
That sounds good.
Thank you, Lauren. So I want to move on. We have a question that's come in from Bara Akan, another student. And the question I'll read, directed to WAFA. If an effective treatment or vaccine is approved in the next several months, what do you think its distribution will look like, given the virus's global effect? Will it be accessible to all, or will citizens have to pay for it out of pocket? And who will be prioritized to get the treatment and vaccine first?
A very important question, and thank you for the question. I'll start, and then I'm sure others can address this as well on the panel. I think fortunately, there are now conversations that are starting to happen in terms of how do we plan for equitable access to vaccines and treatments, and even testing is also another issue that needs to be addressed as well. In terms of vaccines, there's work that's ongoing by, there's a committee that's been established that includes a lot of different stakeholders that are trying to come up with the plan for equitable access to vaccine. Gavi and NGO that's been very involved in enabling low and middle income countries in accessing vaccines has also come up with a plan as well to subsidize the distribution of such a vaccine. And they have a lot of experience having done so for other vaccines, including the usual childhood preventive vaccines, as well as hepatitis vaccine and human papillomavirus vaccine. So I think in terms of the vaccine arena, I'm heartened that there's now serious conversation, including a lot of different stakeholders to try to plan for the vaccine access and distribution. I think we need to tackle another issue related to vaccines, I have to say, which is this whole issue of vaccine hesitancy, and that's very prominent and has been gaining prominence not just in well-resourced countries, but unfortunately also in low and middle income countries. And I think we need to start the work now, engaging the communities that are most likely to benefit from the vaccine, engage them now in discussions and about the vaccine, the availability soon of the vaccine, and then hopefully get them to identify, to be ready and willing to take the vaccine. So we have to do the work now. And that will involve a lot of, again, work in the communities to gain the trust of these communities and engage with their spokespeople and so on. So I think the work needs to happen and is beginning to happen. And it applies similarly to treatments and testing, where similar principles need to apply. Unfortunately, we don't have, as I think Glenn mentioned, we don't have a plan. I mean, I think that it's kind of tragic in the United States. There is no plan. There is no testing plan. There is no treatment plan, because it's all fractured, and it depends on whether somebody lives in this state or that state, and whether someone has this insurance or that insurance or no insurance, and whether they're being seen in the public sector or in the private sector. So it's really a quagmire. And I do think that unfortunately what's going to happen if we don't get this fixed is that we're going to have some people who are going to be left behind.
Right. Thank you. We have many questions, and I want to make sure we squeeze one more in before we wrap things up. And so this question would be to Glenn or Linda from Zaid Masri in Toronto. To what degree should we redirect investments in public health in the event that we encounter a similar public health crisis, such as the current COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I would defer to Linda on the kinds of investment, but I would say structurally, we should be proactive, not reactive. We should be constantly investing in public health infrastructure. We won't know exactly where the next pandemic comes, but we do know that we need an infrastructure to be ready, and that's where we were caught lacking.
So I would second what Glenn said and say that this is a critical moment to say, what do we value? If we value human health and the survival and thrival of our planet, we better transform the way we invest, starting now, nationally and globally, and use this opportunity to change that. Public health is about prevention, and prevention that secures the well-being of all people and raises the floor and the ceiling, not just of health, but of our futures. And we better come out of it. We have to come out of this with a different balancing of priorities and investment, as Glenn said, and valuing of the public goods that are essential ways that we come together as communities and societies to accomplish the things that none of us can accomplish alone. That's the only way out of this, and it's the only way and an effective way to prevent the next pandemic, as well as to prevent the consequences of climate change and the disastrous results of centuries of racism.
You know, what a fitting way to end out our question and answer period, Dean Fried. I mean, I think that you really hit the nail on the head as to the magnitude of the challenge we have facing us and how it's going to set the trajectory for our future. Before I turn it over to Safwan to give some closing remarks, I want to thank all of the students who were really very, very thoughtful in their questions. We also received questions from the audience. We tried to get through many of them. And we thank you all just for your attentiveness and patience as we went through them. Safwan?
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you. I mean, really, this has been just superb, really fantastic. And I wish that we had a couple of more hours to talk amongst one another. And it certainly gives me hope with people, with experts like yourselves, you know, working on some of these issues. This could have been an embarrassment of riches because we have such great minds coming together on the screen, but it's really a delight of riches. And Linda, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your framing and for your brilliant moderation. And Harrison, Wafa, Mary, Glenn, Andy, we were so happy to have you join, and we know that you were doing some other important stuff beforehand. And thanks to the students. I mean, I think any of us who are ever in the classroom always know and acknowledge that the best part of what we do are the students. They challenge us and they are just superb. And Shannon, thank you for stewarding them and for leading them the way that you do, and for the great partnership that we have with you. So I really couldn't thank you enough. Thank you for enriching our knowledge and our minds, and thanks to everybody who joined us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. And so just final few remarks. We've talked about everything today, and this was just fabulous. As I mentioned earlier, this is the final seminar in the summer pilot for the Global Columbia Collaboratory, a virtual exchange platform. And we're looking forward to the exciting lineup for the next cycle of the Global Columbia Collaboratory that will begin this fall. So keep an eye out for our announcements about the fall. Again, thanks again to our moderator, Dean Linda Fried, and all of our esteemed panelists, Mary, Glenn, Andy, Wafa, and Harrison, for joining us today. Special thanks to Safwan and the team at the Columbia Global Centers, Columbia World Projects, Columbia College, and the Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement. And of course, a special thanks to those amazing students who are around the world today joining us. A reminder that a link to the recording of the full webinar will be sent to everyone who registered, and for others, you'll be able to find it on our website. Thank you and be well.
Bye.